So this is January 6th, 2026 of an exciting new year, and we're very privileged to be speaking on behalf of High Plains Journal with Jim Sutter, the longtime CEO of the United States Soybean Export Council, or USSEC, which is laser focused on one job and one job only, which is fostering relationships overseas to grow U.S. markets for soybeans and soy products. And Jim, I understand you just got back from another trip to Asia. And isn't it true that you and most USEC board members do frequent traveling?
Yes, we go out to various markets around the world to be in touch with customers of soy and potential customers of U.S. soy. So, yes, I got back from several different travels late in the last calendar year and actually getting ready to go on more travel, actually departing tomorrow to go to South Asia and the Middle East.
Well, thank you for taking this time to speak with us in between hops. How important are face-to-face meetings in these markets?
I think face-to-face markets are really important. They help. What if we think about our strategic goals? We want to differentiate U.S. soy. We want to build a preference for U.S. soy, and we want to make sure that we have market access to get our U.S. soy into markets. And especially as we work on differentiating and then building that preference, I think for people around the world to get to know people from the U.S., get to know our farmers, because we normally take farmers who are our board members with us. I think that is extremely important to help us in that process. So they understand how the soybeans are grown, the care that is taken into these, the fact that these are family farmers that are producing these crops, and just all of those kind of things. I think you can do all you want by talking with people and sharing information, but I think being able to have that face-to-face contact is really important.
Do you have any announcements?
I guess one announcement, and it wasn't really a recent meeting, but it was in November. There was an agreement signed between the country of Bangladesh and our organization, actually. It was really following through on agreements between Bangladesh and the United States government to purchase $1.25 billion worth of U.S. soy this year and in subsequent years. This is all part of the Liberation Day tariff exercise that was announced last April by President Trump. One of the things that we looked forward to coming out of that was the many free trade agreements that would be consummated between many different countries that wanted to keep their import tariffs as low as possible, shipping goods to the U.S., that they need to buy more goods from the U.S. in order to bring their trade balance closer to zero. And that's what Bangladesh is doing. In December, just before Christmas, I had the opportunity to meet with the new ambassador from Bangladesh to the United States. He took the time to come to St. Louis to have a meeting with our organization and two soybean farmers, as he wanted to learn more about the U.S. soybean industry because of the importance that it will play in helping them to meet these balance of trade balancing requirements, if I can use those words.
Soybeans did make it into the headlines last year, as we know, but do you have any comments to make about the media coverage of the tariffs and soybeans trade with China? Did it seem balanced to you?
The media always seems to be looking for the bad news they can find. I think bad news sells better than good news. And of course, there was uncertainty for our farmers, which is not good news at all. To be able to talk about that uncertainty was the right thing to be doing. I applaud the work done by the American Soybean Association, our sort of sister organization, in highlighting to the U.S. government the situation for U.S. soybeans and the problems that we faced when we lost the ability to sell U.S. soybeans to China. And so I think that by getting that on the talking points of the President of the United States, when the two presidents of these big countries met, they talked about three things: rare earths, fentanyl, and soybeans, and agricultural trade, but I think soybeans was the lead topic. And so that was really great. That happened. And coming out of that summit, I think there was a lot of question of, would China really follow through, and what exactly did all that mean? But I think if we tally up the purchases we've seen to date by China, it's now in excess of 10 million tons out of the 12 million that they agreed to buy for this year. Just by luck, I happened to be in China the week after that meeting and had some very meetings with high-level people, and they confirmed what an important agreement that was in their opinion. So I always have thought that China would live up to their agreements, and they certainly seem to be doing that. think that was a good thing.
Well, that's fantastic news. And that was going to be my next question about whether China is fully re-entering the market, because I've been reading about some possible logistic hiccups, but it doesn't sound like they're too bad now.
No, I don't think so.
Any other markets, important markets that are opening up more than they were previously to U.S., both soybeans and soy meal, that the media hasn't paid as much attention to?
Yeah, so I think one of our real focuses this past year, I mentioned differentiating and building a preference and making sure we attain market access. Overarching all of that is a goal to diversify markets. So we've been trying to work hard to get soy into different places. And an example of that is Syria. Syria used to be an importer of soy, and then for at least 10 years had all kinds of their own internal governmental problems, civil war sort of issues, so they weren't importing anything. But now that they've got themselves in a better situation, we have started doing work in Syria again. We're optimistic that that can become a growing market. I mentioned Bangladesh. That's been a market that's been on our radar for a while and will continue to grow. But other markets where we see growth happening, I always like to mention Egypt, because that's a place that 10 years ago, we hardly exported anything to, and it's now in our top 5 export markets. They are a whole bean import market. So that's one that is very exciting. In terms of meal, you mentioned meal, and the U.S. has more meal to export now as we use more oil to produce biofuels, renewable diesel, biodiesel. We crush more soybeans here in the U.S. We have more meal to export. That goes to several different destinations around the world, but is heavily focused in Southeast Asia. So we have markets like Indonesia, which is a huge producer of their own oil. So they don't really need to import the whole soybean and turn it into meal and oil, but they can import the meal. And so Indonesia is a market we're excited about. Our number 1 meal market in the world is Philippines, just north of Indonesia. We see several other markets out in that part of the world where we expect to see good growth in meal exports in this year and the coming years.
And when you talk about the importance of these markets, neither buyers nor sellers can control geopolitical events, the currency, the price of commodities. But all those things aside, it's my understanding that U.S. soybeans do have the number 1 reputation in the world for cleanness, as they say now, and for reliability and integrity.
We do. And we're very fortunate. I'm very fortunate to be able to be promoting a product like U.S. soy that has such a great reputation, both in terms of quality and in terms of sustainability. And let me just talk a bit about both of those, because our big competitor, Brazil, obviously very strong agricultural country, has grown their soy production and their soy exports a lot in recent years, and a formidable competitor. And they do a good job. Agriculture is very important for their farmers, but they just don't have the same type of climate that we do. And that gives them some challenges. They, of course, have the challenges of having to convert land and then deforestation and all of those kind of topics, which is a concern in many markets around the world. The U.S. doesn't have that. But when it comes to quality, it also makes a big difference. Our soybeans are dried down naturally. Mother Nature, every year around the 1st of October, we get a frost and our soybeans dry down. We don't have to dry them after our farmers harvest them. They're put in the bin or they're taken to market. That's not the case with soybeans from South America, particularly from Brazil. The plant just keeps growing because they don't get a frost. They don't have that natural sort of termination of the growing season. So they harvest the soy, they terminate the plant chemically. They then harvest the soybeans at a much higher moisture level so they can get on and do something else on that farm. But then those wet soybeans, they have to dry. So they run them through dryers, often wood-fired, at very high temperature. And that has negative effects on both the nutritional capacity of the soybean and the oil quality. It puts a dark color into that oil quality, which many people don't want. So we really do have a quality advantage as well as a sustainability advantage. And I would be remiss if I don't also mention the reliability advantage that our great export infrastructure gives to the U.S.
Well, thank you for bringing that up, Jim, since I also write for a barge publication. And I don't know if you remember, but I actually interviewed you maybe 6 or 7 years ago for my other publication.
I do. Or I
So, what do you see coming in the year ahead for? So, all these deals are signed, China's fulfilling its promises, and it would seem like 2026 is going to be a pretty good year for soybean producers.
Yeah, I am excited about the coming year. I think we need to get more of these mini freight free trade deals coming out of the Liberation Day tariffs put into force. I think those will be helpful for our industry. An interesting thing that we're watching carefully, if we look at the data for the 25-26 year, this will be the smallest increase in global production of soy in the last several years, the last 5 years. Every other year, we've increased by about as much as soy demand has increased. So we've had this kind of balanced situation between global supply and demand grows 15, 20 million tons on a global basis every year. People say, why is it growing? There are many countries around the world where people don't get to consume as much protein as they want. And as their economic situation improves, they then want to consume some more meat generally. And meat takes protein to raise it. And then oftentimes people also like to use some oil when they're cooking their food. So the soybean's got a natural thing. It's got both the protein and the oil content. So I see demand continuing to increase, but production, it's not going to go down. I think it'll be a record level, but it's only going to be a few million tons more than the previous year. Because here in the US, we were flat at best. We'll get the final numbers here soon, but we were probably flat. And in South America, yes, they're talking about a record crop, but only slightly above this past year. So I think for the first time in several years, we're going to increase global demand more than global supply. So I think it'll be interesting to see what the impact is on prices. And the other thing we are seeing, and I hear this from people I go and talk to in many different markets around the world, is the profitability that meat producers are enjoying, whether that is poultry producers in Vietnam or in Egypt or in you name a country. Everybody in the protein production business, or almost everybody, is making money. And that's good for meal demand because they want to make sure that they're feeding these animals as well as they can. I point that out because I think when you're in this situation with demand growing faster than supply and people being profitable, it doesn't mean that they're going to cut back on their demand. I think they're going to continue to buy. And I think that can have possibly a positive impact on prices and certainly an optimistic outlook for the future.
And soy is meeting the demand for feed in many different, with salmon farms as well
Absolutely.
as land-based forms of protein. So it's really got the market covered.
Absolutely. Aquaculture is an important source of demand, and aquaculture continues to fill a growing amount of global seafood consumption. Aquaculture is now bigger than the wild catch. So we do a lot of work in the aquaculture area.
Jim, I was going to ask you about the yield, not decrease, but the slight. Is that due in this country to acreage shrinkage or to yields being not increasing as much?
So it's acreage decreasing. This past year, our acres were down a little bit. The yield hasn't grown as much as we have been thinking that the trend line yield would grow, but it's really been acreage. Now, there's a lot of talk about will we see acreage growth for 26? Who knows exactly how that will turn out? I know there are many factors that farmers are weighing as they compare the income opportunities for corn versus soybeans versus other crops.
Because it's my understanding that we do get a lot of our bushel increases in soy from yields. I mean, rather than having to increase acreage, we don't have to burn down forests to plant new soy acres.
No, certainly in the US. I don't mean to infer that we need to deforest or convert land. In the US, we pretty much have a fixed amount of land that we're going to farm, and it's just what crops farmers tend to choose to plant on their acres. They can switch back and forth between corn and soybeans, obviously, and that's what they do in much of the Midwest. In other areas, they may plant a little more soybeans, a little less wheat. They may, in the South, they look at cotton as an alternative. So it's really that switching among acres. But no, in the US, our land mass is pretty much fixed. And I'm a believer that we're going to continue to increase these yields going forward. I mentioned this year we really didn't get that because we had some pretty tough growing conditions around the US. But I think if we get a normal growing condition year, we could see a good uptick in yields.
So, what else do you see coming down the pike in the coming year as far as regulatory improvements or challenges for U.S. soy growers?
Something that we're watching and looking at carefully, I don't know quite how this will turn out, but is this whole notion of sustainability. And we've gotten away from talking about sustainability so much in the US because it's maybe not politically correct, maybe not something people want to be talking about, but it hasn't stopped around the rest of the world. If you look at surveys that are done, especially with younger consumers, millennials, Gen Z people, they have a real strong concern about what is happening to the environment as the food that they're eating is being produced. And so they've got a very strong goal of purchasing food that's not hurting the environment. So I think that has the potential to be a real strong differentiator for US soy versus soy from other origins. Because let's face it, we talked about we're not increasing our footprint in this country. Other countries, that's the way that they've grown their production so much. They've increased their footprint, and they've done that in ways that are not necessarily what environmentalists would want to see happening in terms of the impact that it has on carbon sequestration, carbon footprint, all of those kind of things. So I think that is something, it's not necessarily regulatory. It had the potential to be regulatory if the EU had passed their EU deforestation regulation, which the US soy industry was hoping that they would. They postponed that for another year, but it was very, as well as soy and palm oil, it was just so complicated. We believe it would have given the US soy industry a real competitive advantage versus South America in terms of our ability to comply with their regulations.
And does American or North American soy continue to do well within the EU as an export market?
It does. We have a strong market share in the EU. They're a mature set of markets that use soy in a diverse set of ways. They import some meal just for their livestock industry. They import some soybeans for crushing for both the meal and the oil. They use some of the oil for biofuels, some for human consumption. But yes, we have a good share there. We split it between South American origin that goes in there and US origin soy that goes in there. I think we would have seen growth in our US market share had they moved forward with that EUDR regulation. But again, as I said before, it's been postponed. Maybe it'll come the next year. I do believe that there are some buyers in the EU. We hear some talking about even if the EUDR hasn't been put in place, they may want to try to differentiate their own product by having a kind of EUDR compliant product being used to feed their poultry or their pigs, even though the regulations haven't come into effect yet.
That's interesting because it's the labels that the consumers see that are going to matter in the end, whether or not there's a regulation behind them.
Exactly. And definitely, we have speaking of label, we have a logo. We have actually two logos. One says Sustainable US Soy, and the other one says Fed with Sustainable US Soy. And people can use these logos on their products, assuming they meet certain criteria and are truly using verified sustainable US soy. But we have 21 countries, about 1,100 products that are now utilizing those labels. And I think it is so much fun to go into a market around the world, whether it's a package of eggs in Guatemala or tofu in Japan or cooking oil in Taiwan, and see the Sustainable US Soy logo on those products. And people may look at that and say, wow, what does that really mean? In my opinion, for a company to put something on their brand, on their logo, they don't do that lightly. That is their billboard in front of the consumer's eyes. That's what the consumer looks at when they're making a decision whether to buy something or not. So I think it's critically important that when people do that, and I think it really says something that they are believing in our US soy industry. So I always like to just take a moment and say thank you to the US soy farmers who make that possible, because without them farming in the way that they do, we would not be able to have all of these sustainability claims that are verified by organizations all around the world. Our farmers are doing things right. And that allows consumers around the world to be able to look at those little labels and say, I'm getting the product I want for future generations as I'm cooking my food.
And when you say verified by organizations all around the world, that means they visit our soybean farmers and look at how our farmers are growing our beans. So they inspect every part of it, correct?
Correct. They don't necessarily inspect every farm. That would be a little over, but they do sampling, they do checking. Yes, there are auditing practices that are followed by these organizations that do the verification. The first verification we got was from the European-wide feed industry. They had hired a third party, part of the WTO actually, to find sustainable methodologies that were being used to grow soy. So that was the first one that verified the U.S. soy industry. And we always think about the Europeans being quite tough in this regard. So that was a challenging one to get. But we have several more of those verification bodies now that have reviewed in great detail how our U.S. soy is produced and now confirmed that the U.S. Soy Sustainability Assurance Protocol, which is the process that has to be followed for people to be able to verify the soy as sustainable.
Well, Jim, this has been a master class on U.S. soy production and export. I was going to ask you about the industrial uses, but those are mostly domestic, I think, aren't they? The industrial uses of soybean oil.
The domestic. We're doing a little bit of work with promotion of some of the domestic products internationally, but it is mainly a domestic.
Is there a possible future in which those uses could become export materials, or is this domestic demand going to soak up all that?
Biofuels, I think it will be primarily a domestic thing. One example, one exception to that could be I was in Japan in September, and they are talking about utilizing a lot more sustainable aviation fuel going forward. And so most of those industrial uses would be domestic. An exception to that may be sustainable aviation fuel. And I think about a market like Japan, where they hope to use a lot of sustainable aviation fuel. They actually have goals to be using 3% of their total aviation fuel needs as SAF by the year 2030, which is just around the corner in terms of the planning for these things. And so as Japan looks at ways to balance their trade situation with the US, again, back to these Liberation Day tariff deals, maybe buying some sustainable aviation fuel from the United States could be a way for them to help balance their trade issues and be able to meet their sustainable aviation fuel goals. So that's one we're watching closely. But as you said, most of the biofuel production in the US will be used domestically.
But it does sound like in the future that that could be an important export consideration since we don't have any. I mean, there are different sources of sustainable aviation fuel, and soy is just one of them, but there isn't a substitute for it yet.
No, I mean, it has to come from matter like either ethanol or soybean oil or animal fats or something like that. Correct.
Well, Jamie, you've given us a master class on soy export markets and possibilities. If there's anything else that could encourage our growers, we'd be glad to hear it.
No, I think what I would add would be that there's a lot of pessimism. It seems if you think about international trade, gloomy and demand is not very good. I think in the case of soy, we continue to see demand growing around the world, as I mentioned earlier. Our organization and lots of exporters continue to do work to diversify markets for soy. China's going to remain important, but we don't want China to be too big. We want to have a slice of the Chinese business and lots of other markets around the world. And that's what our organization is working on every day. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.
And thank you, Jim, on behalf of all soy consumers and soy growers and the American farmer.
My pleasure. It's an honor to work for U.S. soy farmers and represent the U.S. ag industry in markets around the world.